two chapters to cover and then the test. Chapter 7, War for America. Now I had a student ask me what page we're on. We're on the page, folk, that starts chapter 7, whichever book you happen to have and whatever. Anyway, the War for America, it's often called the Revolutionary War. Your chapter opens up with a vignette, and by the way, I might take the liberty to ask some questions from the vignette on your test. I've worked on your next test already, and some of the questions on that test will be from these vignettes, so it does do you good to read them. The vignette is about Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams. John Adams became our second president, but she was hoping that the move for independence would mean more rights and liberties for women. Her husband John was not the least bit interested. Now the letters that John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail, we do have them, and they are considered a big part of colonial history. They describe a lot of the day-to-day life of women in colonial period. Very important. But they also show that Abigail Adams was very politically minded and very concerned. John Adams was concerned that what he saw was rebellion. He said that children are more rebellious these days than ever, and women are more rebellious than ever against their husbands. Folk, it seems like every generation thinks that the next generation is more and more rebellious against authority, even though I will say this on a personal note. I hear of instances where that kids will spit on their teachers, and I'm talking elementary school, not college, kick their teachers. They'll do the same thing to their bus drivers. To me, things have to be worse today as far as rebellion. But our country was founded on rebellion, and the rebellion might have, over time, slid down to where it meant rebellion against any kind of authority at all, whether it be parental authority, the authority of school officials, and even bus drivers are kicked at, yelled at, spit at, and physically attacked, assaulted. It's the time we're living in, and in John Adams' day, I don't think things that the rebellion ever got that bad. Also, there's such a thing as covering it up. A lot of principals and superintendents will say we have no discipline problems here, when the teachers will say otherwise. But, all right, so much for my talk about today's public schools. But anyway, rebellion. Our country started out as a rebellion against the authority of the mother country in England. Right after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress met. This Congress was like the first one. It was an unofficial Congress. It had not been authorized by England. It had no legal authority to act, but nevertheless it took on legal authority. It had no constitution. Eventually someone drafted some rules that it had to go by, and these rules are called the Articles of Confederation. Don't write that down yet. We'll talk about it in the next chapter. But it operated under the Articles of Confederation. There was no president during our entire Revolutionary War. Now there were several men who headed the Congress, among them a man named John Hancock. And I've also heard and read that one of the men who headed the Second Continental, they elected a new official every time they met. One of them was black. I've tried researching that, and I can't find it in my research, but I have heard that one of the men who headed it was a black man. So if that be the case, Barack Obama was really not our first black president. But officially we had no president, just someone who led the Congress. The Congress had to do two contradictory tasks. Number one, it had to fight a war, and number two, it had to try to make peace. Their initial goal was to try to make peace with England without further war. War is very risky business, especially going to war against the most powerful nation on earth like England. But they raised an army, and this let the people of England know that this was not just a local uprising in Boston, but this uprising involved all 13 colonies. They raised an army. They appointed George Washington as head of the army. And George Washington, well, he got on his white horse and galloped toward Boston in order to take charge of the army that had just been raised. So he was not there with the rest of the Second Continental Congress. In addition, in July, they wrote the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit. The Declaration was written by Thomas Jefferson. John Adams was somewhat the leader of the colonies, but he was a New Englander. They asked him to write the Declaration. He wanted to get the other states involved. He wanted to make sure this was not just a New England rebellion. So he turned to a Virginian named Thomas Jefferson, who was probably the most learned man in the colonies, except for Ben Franklin maybe, and said, "Mr. Jefferson, you write it." So Thomas Jefferson went into another room, got out his feather, and dipped his feather into ink. That's the way they wrote in those days, feather and quill. Got his quill pen and wrote the Declaration. Now, folks, the way he wrote it, I don't want to see any of you write. His paragraphs were one-sentence paragraphs, over and over again. One sentence, and they all began, except for a couple of them, with "he has, he has, he has, he has, he has." That he was a reference, obvious reference to King George III. He has done this to us. He has done that. And don't, in your writing, don't begin two consecutive paragraphs with the same clause or the same phrase, even the same words. It's just not considered proper in today's writing, but he did it. Now, we have been told that taxation was the number one issue, but if you actually look at the Declaration of Independence, yes, he mentions taxation. It's something like issue number 19, way down the list. The big issue seems to have been the appointment of governors. He has appointed governors over us without our consent. He has placed judges over us without our consent. He has forced us to pay the wages of these judges and governors. He has taken our people abroad to be tried in English courts where that they cannot get their own people to witness in favor of them. And he has used English juries to try our people instead of using the jury of our own people. All this was a clear-cut violation of laws that had been on the English books for hundreds of years. The law against taxation with representation, that had been on the English books for at least 400 years. And in fact, it had been less than a little bit more than 100 years before that a king of England tried to rule without parliament, and they chopped off his head, King Charles I. So the American Revolution was trying to get the king to abide by laws that were on the book. The problem was the cost of ruling a country from across 4,000 miles of ocean was more than the British could afford to pay. Simply put, the British, you might think the British were tyrants, this is what the colonials thought, but the fact is the British government could not afford to pay the cost of, transporting your government from England over here or getting your American colonials to go over there and be part of the parliament. Also, the English people did not want colonial people in parliament to vote on issues that only affected them. Well, anyway, the Declaration was sent to the King of England, and it also was sent to all the 13 colonies. Copies of it were made, and we do have a few originals. The originals have been put inside a sealed container, and all oxygen has been taken away from the original documents to where that there's only, I believe, maybe helium or hydrogen, but some inert gas that will preserve the declarations of independence for hundreds of years. Now, the reason, folk, that we celebrate the 4th of July, and I taught next to a teacher many years ago, I always want my pupils to know why Americans celebrate 4th. The Declaration of Independence has that date on it. Now, your book has a copy of it in the back, and here in this school, there used to be a copy of it in the Student Center. I don't know if it's still there or not, but at the very top it has "In Congress, July 4th, 1776. Now, some people have said we should not really celebrate July 4th, that we really should celebrate August 2nd. The Declaration was written on July 2nd. It was debated on July 4th, but it was not ratified till August 2nd, a month after it was originally written. But nevertheless, July 4th is a date on the Declaration, so that's the date. Even though if you lived in England at the time, you would not have known because it took about 3 months for the copy of the Declaration to get to England. But on August 2nd, they ratified it and a bunch of them signed it. The number one signature on the Declaration of Independence is in big, bold print. John Hancock had heard that the King of England had eye trouble and had to wear glasses. like a lot of people still do. So he said the King of England won't need eyeglasses, so he won't need his spectacles to see this. He wrote in big letters. To this day, we'll sometimes refer to your signature as your John Hancock, or put your John Hancock right here. He wrote really large. Other signers, Ben Franklin was there and he signed it. Thomas Jefferson, of course, signed it. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, a Catholic man in Maryland, he signed. Robert Morris signed it. Two of Robert E. Lee's relatives signed it. Several men signed it. John Adams, of course, signed it. Some of the leading prominent Americans signed the Declaration, and a copy of it was sent to England. Copies were sent all over the colonies. The last part of the Declaration says, therefore the colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. We had declared it, we were no longer under the rule of Great Britain. We had to fight for it. I mean, I'm speaking as an American, about Americans. We had to fight for it. The royal governors the king had sent over to be our governors, for the most part, got on board ships and sailed back to England. So did the judges. So the American colonies were, for all practical purposes, on their own. Now, not every colonial wanted to separate from Great Britain. So there were a lot of persons, and they were called loyalists. The Loyalists had a very hard time in America. A lot of them fled to Canada. A lot of them had their houses taken away. Now, your book will mention how that some of them had their houses taken away. They eventually, some of them got them back because they said, oh, my father, true, was a loyalist, but my mother was a patriot. They were always the patriots for the persons who are on the American side. And if they could show that one of their parents were patriots, they could sometimes get their property back. But a lot of loyalists had their houses burned, their property taken away. And like I say, the British would try to protect them for a while, but the British could not be everywhere at once, so the British would oftentimes pack up and move and leave the loyalists completely at the mercy of the English. A lot of slaves. A lot of slaves ran over to the British. The British protected them for a while. The British sent some of them to Canada, and a bunch of black people still live in Canada. We'll find out later that more and more black people went to Canada to escape slavery. Some of them went to Great Britain, and their descendants are still there. But anyway, the document tells the world why they were fighting and what they were fighting for. The Congress also issued paper money. And again, the value of this paper money would fluctuate depending on how much the people thought the money would be worth. Now, for generations, all paper money that was issued by the government had gold to back it up. In other words, the gold was kept at Fort Knox, still is, a lot of it. This was true until Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard. The issue of paper money, folk, is a tough, hard issue. It seems trivial today, but, all right. I spent 27 years at Lockheed. What if Lockheed had had to pay its workers in gold and silver coins? At one point, Lockheed had 33,000 workers. Once when I was there, they had more than 20,000 workers. It would take an army of people just to count the coins, and but also, supposing Lockheed could only have paid its workers when it had the money. One time when I was at Lockheed, the company spent 5 whole months without selling an airplane. Then all of a sudden they sold about 6 aircraft at once, C-130, which 6 at once. Well, what would have happened? This sounds hilarious, but all the workers would have lined up to receive 5 months back pay, and they'd all had to put their gold and silver on wheelbarrows to wheel it out to their cars, and then they'd have to hope that they could get to the bank without being robbed, so they'd have to get together in posses to line up, and all of them go to the banks at once, because otherwise all this gold and silver might be robbed. I mean, it's hilarious. So the point I'm making is, without paper money, you cannot have a complex economy. Simply can't. But until, again, at one time, though, the paper money had to be backed up by gold by a man named Richard Milhouse Nixon, one of our presidents. You've probably all heard of him. Took us off the gold standard, I believe in 1972 or thereabout, maybe 1971. Thereabout, took us off the gold standard. So today, paper money is just that. It's paper. But we all have agreed to accept it as payment. Now, I say that tongue in cheek, because money today mostly consists of electronic transactions. I get my Social Security. I don't get a check in the mailbox anymore like we used to. It's all electronically transferred to my checking account. Most of you probably know what I'm talking about. That's the way we get paid today. And I also got a check from this college 2 days ago. It was transferred by electronic means to my account. It's not like my boss had to come here today and hand it to me. I mean, you know. It's electronically transferred. Very convenient. I stopped this morning on my way in to have breakfast. Electronic transfer from my checking account to the restaurant's account. Most of you probably know what I'm talking about. Today, that's money. That was, of course, using technology that did not exist at the time we're talking about. But what constitutes money, folk, is very, very important. Again, you cannot, we now know, and James Madison didn't realize this, and a lot of our founding fathers, you cannot have a complex economy if you're just using gold and silver coins. Simply can't. All right. Anyway, the Congress would issue paper money, but the paper money fluctuated in value, and that's one reason why men like James Madison turned against it. Now, oh yeah, the delegates were highly suspicious of Ben Franklin. He was there, but he had spent the last 11 years in England, and during his time in England, he had become close friends with King George III, and everybody thought, hey, again, Ben Franklin had a knack for making friends with people who were different. He became close friends with George Whitefield, and the two of them were as different theologically as far apart as you can get. Franklin was a skeptic. Whitefield was a revivalist preacher. Yet they made friends. And as for George III, Franklin grew up in poverty. George III grew up as Prince of Wales. But again, they made friends for a while. A lot of people didn't trust Franklin for that reason. I must mention this, folks. Franklin had another problem. He was a lifetime womanizer. And a lot of these men, were afraid that Ben Franklin would disgrace the whole colonial movement because he could not leave the women alone. Folk, this is history, and I don't mean to be like spreading rumors and gossip, but this did figure into the situation why some of the colonial men at the time mistrusted Franklin. John Adams was always faithful to his wife. George Washington, as far as always faithful to his. And Thomas Jefferson, when he went to France, loused up a time or two. Then when his wife died, he took up with a slave girl. This has now been proven. So he wasn't quite perfect. A lot of these men were morally upright, and Ben Franklin came up short in that area. But anyway, he was there, and when Thomas Jefferson found his declaration debated, went into a room kind of to sulk. Ben Franklin came over to him and said, listen, I've been through this myself. This is what happens in a democracy. You're right, you're what they tell you to write, and by the time it's changed. And I want to remind you, folk, if you ever get in government, if you go to Congress and send a bill through Congress, by the time Congress gets through churning it around, and if the bill ever passes, it won't be anything like what you originally sent. This can happen to anybody. And a lot of congressmen have sometimes wound up wishing they had never started a bill that turned out to be completely different from what they wanted it to be. All right. Well, the British General Gage, received reinforcements. Now, General Howe was under the General Gage at the time. But anyway, General Gage started out at first, and he was told to rout the rebels out of Boston. He went to fight at Breed's Hill. We call it the Battle of Bunker Hill. He drove the event in the long run. The first two times the British charged up the hill, they were driven back. The third time, the colonials ran out of ammunition, and they retreated. No ammunition meant they couldn't fight. General Howe, who was General Gage's top assistant, urged General Gage to pursue them. If General Howe's advice had been taken, the war might have ended. But General Howe's advice was not taken, so the war did not end. Eventually, the King of England replaced General Gage with General Howe, and General Howe decided to be more aggressive than the old General Gage had been. All right, anyway, the British were to go through about 3 or 4 generals. General Gage, General Howe, General Clinton. Those are the three top ones. General Cornwallis, I've got his name there because he's the one who surrendered. All right. Stand corrected. Howe was the one who did not pursue, General Howe, who did not pursue the retreating colonials. If he would have, the war might have ended there. General Howe didn't pursue them. Now, General Howe was to make another mistake I'll talk about in a few minutes that led him to resign. Now, George Washington arrived in New England shortly after the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he saw things go on he did not like. He saw colonial officers setting up businesses of shaving men, and the officers actually make money shaving their men. Now, folk, if you know anything about an army, this is a no-no in an army. Some of the officers are setting up little bitty shops where they sell things like cigarettes and snacks, cookies and whatever to the men. Folk, this is no-go in an army. I mean, so Washington said that he had a meeting of his men and said, hey, you know, we have to stop this. We cannot allow this kind of thing to go on. There must be a separation of men and officers. And if you don't understand why this is necessary, hopefully later on as you go up you will, but there has to be a separation of people in charge and people who are not in charge. Last week, a girl on the other path bought some donuts, so I said, that's okay with me, but I myself will not participate. As I've been teaching here 19 and a half years, and I've never eaten or drunk in front of my class, and hopefully I never will. I consider it unprofessional. So I did not participate. Some of the other class, that's fine. If any of you, I see some of you have drinks, some of you, I don't have any problem with that. But you know, I had a girl, young woman, offer me a Coke just before a final exam. I politely declined. So one of the boys wound up taking a Coke. But, anyway, there has to be a separation, folk, between the rank and the non-rank. All right. The Second Continental Congress, while Washington was working out, taking over and trying to organize an army, the Second Continental Congress put out the Olive Branch Petition. Now, Olive Branch. What the olive branch means is we offer peace. The olive branch has become a universal symbol of peace, and it harks all the way back to the Bible when during the flood, Noah sent out a dove, and the dove came back in the evening with an olive branch in its beak. And that let everyone in the ark know that, hey, there's somewhere where plant life is growing, somewhere the waters have receded, and especially olives do not start growing right away. It takes some months. So that means there's been plant life on the ground for several months for there to be an olive leaf plucked off. So the dove, I mean, the symbol of the olive branch heading toward the ark, this has become the universal symbol of the United Nations for peace. Now, I want to remind you, the flood story is not just found in the Bible. The flood story is found on every nation on earth, on every tribe on earth. It's universal. Everybody has heard it. Anyway, the olive branch, whether they offered, well, the difference between the olive branch and the Declaration of Independence, the olive branch petition was an appeal to the king, where they instead of blaming the king like the Declaration of Independence did, the olive branch petition laid the blame on Parliament and basically exonerated the king and said, hey, it's all Parliament's fault. And they were hoping that this would kind of butter up the king and persuade the king to have peace. The king rejected the olive branch petition and instead sent a bigger army over, more reinforcements, and the war went on. So the olive branch petition was a noble attempt, did not work. Now, a person arrived from England about this time. He'd been in the colonies less than a year when he wrote it. A man named Thomas Paine. And weirdly enough, I was researching Thomas Paine just last night, and I learned that the man had tried many ways to earn a living and had failed in every one of them. He had tried going into his father's profession, and that didn't work. He had tried being a storekeeper, a school teacher. None of that worked. And he tried writing, but he couldn't make any money off of it. And finally he decided, I'll come to America. He came to America and quickly caught the spirit of rebellion among the Americans. So he joined George Washington's army as a writer, and he wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. And among the things he said in the pamphlet was, who is to say that the son of a king, even a good king, is qualified to be king? This was an obvious reference to George III, because Thomas Paine, having grown up in England, knew that the young King George III had not been able to do his lessons as a boy, was a slow learner, even though his father, his father never got to be king, but his father had been smart, his grandfather had been smart. George II was fairly a smart man, but then George III was appeared to be lacking in intelligence. And it said just because his grandfather was king and just because he comes from a line of king doesn't mean the man should be king. He said government officials should be chosen, should be elected, and the elections should occur often. And he was listened to, and his Common Sense pamphlet got him fame, but did not get him a lot of money. He died in poverty. The man had a problem with money, and money just went out of his pockets faster than it came in. A lot of us have that issue. But anyway, he wrote the pamphlet, got a lot of popularity, but not a lot of money. Well, the first year of the war,